One of the most disturbing things to me about modern warfare, in particularly, is when you get to like the grand scale conflicts, nation against nation, region against region, kind of war of the worlds type stuff, World War I, World War II. Both sides usually claim to have God on their side, right? Like when it comes to little small scale conflicts, warring tribes, it may be about greed, power, money, some sort of nefarious thing. But usually, when things escalate to the global level, it's the war of ideologies. It's a group of people, a leader, a nation, a region saying, we believe that this vision for the world is usually what God has in mind. Now, they may think of God differently and talk about him differently, but usually, by and large, it's this vision God has for this. And then another side, we think God has this in mind. You could think about the war over, kind of socialism, communism, and capitalism of the world wars. You could talk about the war on terror as a war of ideology between radical Islam and kind of a Western society. It's crazy to me how people at the highest level believe this is a very clear vision that God has for us and how the other side can do the same. And it's not just on the big level, it's on kind of the military level, right? That mid-level structure, we think in terms of allies and enemies. It's necessary for operational clarity to think of our allies as the people on the right side of history and our enemies as the bad guys. But it's not usually quite that clear cut, although sometimes it seems like it. Think about the individual level, right? Maybe World War II, a German trench and an Allied forces trench, right? You can think of somebody from the UK or from America praying in English on this side of the front. God, deliver me from the evil one in the other trench. And then you could imagine somebody maybe speaking German in the other trench praying the exact same thing of the person across as they rain hellfire on each other from dusk, from dawn until dusk, and sometimes a little bit afterwards. It's complicated in war to figure out the difference between right and wrong, what's true and what's false. Like the lines get blurred. Now, when we're not in wartime scenarios or when you're far away from the front, it's tempting to believe that categories of right and wrong and true and falsehood are easier to define. When things are relatively at peace, we think we know pretty well what God's vision is for our lives and for our world and for our nation. We even think that we can relatively, in a decent way, judge other people based on what we believe God's will is for their life and what's happening in their lives right now. We think we have a clearer access to truth to judge ourselves and judge other people. Now, it's convenient to me that wartime or not, God always seems to be on my side, right? And I can't work out for absolutely everybody, so maybe there's something bigger going on. How do we know what's happening? Well, I want to teach you a philosophical term. It's a big word. Are you ready today? This is it. It's called epistemology. I'm not saying a bad word. Epistemology is a category in philosophy to talk about what we know and how we know it. What is truth? How do we define truth? How do we trust our faculties to know truth? How do we know this and trust that what we know is right? These are big questions, and you may be thinking, man, if we're going down that road today, I'm going to go ahead and tap out. Don't tap out with me. Because categories of this, like this sort of discussion, what is true? How can we know things? Are really relevant to a story in John chapter 9. That's where we're going to dig in today. If you want to open your Bible, throw it up on your phone. It's going to be on the screen. This is how the chapter starts out. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? Now, of course, the way that the question is framed would have you believe there's only two options, right? Sin or sin. Is it his personal sin or his parents' sin that left him in this really precarious place? Because surely God wouldn't allow this to happen unless sin had corrupted it in a very tangible way. That's the way his disciples were thinking. That may be the way that we're tempted to think, to come up with really clear categories of anything that's wrong in somebody's life is sin, and anything that's not is God's blessing. Well, Jesus comes up with, how about response number 3? Can I choose option C, please? This is what he says. It's not because of his sins or his parents' sins. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. And we must quickly carry out the tasks assigned to us. Remember, we're talking urgent now in the Gospel of John, because night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I'm here, I am the light of the world. And then he spits on the ground, made mud with his saliva, and spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. And he told him, "Go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So the man went, washed, and came back seeing. This is a crazy story. A man born blind from birth who gets his sight back. Now, what's Jesus teaching us in this little section so far? I believe he's telling us, man, this world is a messed up spot. There's crazy stuff that happens. Some of you are born into problems. Some of you marry into problems. Some of you guys dig a hole of your own making and find yourself in a problem. But there's also this swirling, corrupt thing that sin has done where the whole world is not the way it's supposed to be. And everything that's wrong in your life may not personally be your fault. It may not even personally be your parents' fault. Well, one person it's not is God's fault. God is going to figure out a way to use even the things in your life that you never thought could be used. He wasn't born blind because of his sin or his parents' sin, but God is going to show up in this story in a way that's undeniable. And I believe he does the same thing in our lives today. He's going to show up and do something new. Jesus is giving us a new way of thinking. He's saying, how about rather than describing this person by their supposed sin, what you think you know about them? What if we instead describe them about God's potential in them? Rather than saying, this person is blind from birth because of their sin, what if we said, this person has an amazing opportunity for God's story to shine bright through them? What if we looked at our problems differently? Then whose fault is this? And instead could say, how could God use this? Jesus is giving us a new way of thinking and discerning the truth of the world. Now, after this guy is healed, and he comes back from the pool and he can see, it's such a disorienting thing, new creation often is, that even his closest buddies aren't sure this is the same dude. This is how the story continues. Cue in on like the knowledge, knew, and knows. Verse 8, his neighbors and others who knew him before, or knew him while he was blind, asked, is this the man who used to sit and beg? Some said he was. Others said, no, can't be. Just looks like him. The beggar said, no, it's me. It's me. It's me. I'm the same one. And they asked, well, who healed you and what happened? This question gets repeated a few times. Who healed you and what happened? And he told them. The man they called Jesus made mud, which would have been real gross, and spread it over my eyes and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. And they say, well, where's he at now? He said, I don't know. I'm just reporting the facts. I was blind, now I see. He put mud on my eyes, I washed, and boom, they were open, and I don't know where he went. A quick note here. One thing to ask is, has Jesus so radically transformed your life that the people who knew you before Jesus actually recognize difference? Like, could this really be the same person? Like, what? They're so radically different. It's a good question just to ask ourselves, do other people see the difference that Jesus has made in you? Now, after this guy responds to the crowd at large, they're not satiated. It's got to move from the streets to the steeple. It goes from just, who is this Jesus and what has he done for you, out in the crowd into the Pharisaical sect. Here's how the story continues, verse 13. They took this man who had been blind to the Pharisees because, it was the Sabbath. Man, Jesus just really liked to burst the bubble on the Sabbath, didn't he? Because it was the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. The Pharisees asked the man all about it. And he told them, again, just matter of fact, just stating the plain reality of what happened. He put mud on my eyes, and then I washed it away, and I could see. Now, the Pharisees responding to this testimony say, okay. Let me tell you what we know about your story. You say you know this. Let us tell you what we know about your life and about this man named Jesus. Some of the Pharisees said, this man, Jesus, is not from God, for he is working on the Sabbath. Very clear. We know it for sure. Now, others in the own group are saying, but how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? Jesus has created deep division even among these ideologues by this radical thing that he's doing. The Pharisees are questioning everything they supposedly know about God. And I don't know if you've been in a season of your life where you question some major things. Relationships, jobs, finances, calling, past trauma, whatever. When you're in those seasons of your life, it's really unsettling, isn't it? You pretty much want to do anything other than think about those things that are disorienting. And that's exactly what the Pharisees do. They deflect. They just can't handle the pressure of trying to figure out where they might have gone wrong. So rather than saying, goodness gracious, we could possibly have something wrong here, they look at this man who was blind from birth and say, you're wrong. I could never be wrong because we know the truth already. Here's what happens. The Jewish leaders, after even seeing him in person, refused to believe the blind man who could now see. So they want some extra witnesses. They call in his mom and pop, and they ask his parents, is this your son? And was he born blind? And if so, how can he now see? We need some more information, right? His parents replied, we know this is our son, and we know that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can now see. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. And then you get a little of a commentary here to understand what's happening. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who had already announced that anyone who said Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue, which is a big deal. It's not just like, hey, get up and get out of church today. Like the synagogue and the temple was their entire ordered life. That might have meant that they couldn't even continue to do business in the region. They wouldn't have access to the rites and rituals of their religious system to be right with God. Like, this is a big deal. It's their entire world at stake. So they say, we don't know. He's old enough. Ask him. So for a second time, they call in the man who'd been born blind, and they told him, God should get glory for this, which is a confusing kind of twist in the story so far. God should get glory for this because we know. We know 100% down pat, we're completely sure that Jesus is a sinner. What's happening? The Pharisees, because now they can't deny this man was born blind and now he can see, are trying to draw a very defined line between Jesus and God. They're saying, we can't deny that you were born blind and now you can see, but we can certainly deny that it was Jesus. God should get glory for this, young man. So confess, tell us the real truth how this happened, because it couldn't have been him. Here's what I think is happening. Remember just 2 chapters ago where Jesus says, if you cling to my teaching, if you're faithful to me, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Remember we talked about that? Here's what the Pharisees are saying when they say, give God glory for this. They're saying in code, speak our truth, and we will set you free. That is what's going on here. Because after all, we know this Jesus dude is a sinner. Here's what I think the text is teaching all of us today. There are going to be people in your life who will try to convince you that your religious experience with Jesus isn't real and trustworthy. There are going to be people who are smart. They're sharp. Maybe people you trust. Maybe somebody who you need them to like you to get to a certain place. And they're going to tell you that there's a lot of things that can explain what's happened in your life, the changes that happen in your life. We can explain away your religious experience, your devotion to Jesus. We can come to a new, clearer understanding of who you are, why you're here, and what you're supposed to do. There are people who are going to try to convince you that your experience with Jesus isn't real and can't be trusted. And let me tell you the truth. Their truth will never set you free. Whose truth are you going to listen to here? Jesus's, or these authority figures who want to steer you away from Jesus? I think we learn a lot from how this once begging blind man is able to have boldness before the religious leaders of his day who have his family in their clutches. Listen to how this continues. We know this man is a sinner. Well, here's his response. Verse 25. I don't know whether he's a sinner or not. He uses the word very different connotation. It's not hard and rigid and fast. We know this stuff. We're never going to question it. He's like, I don't really know whether this man's a sinner or not by your categories. I don't want you to put your words in my mouth. Let me tell you what I know, what I have experienced with Jesus. It's really quite simple. I've already told you. I was blind, and now I can see. Like, that's an unquestionable truth for me. And so the question is repeated. Well, what did he do? And how did he do it? And the response from this once blind man says, look, I've told you once. Why didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Then it gets a little bit chirpy, right? Do you guys want to become his disciples too? And at this point, they're like, man, we got to get this guy out of here. They cursed him. They said, you're his disciple. We're disciples of Moses. Why? Because we know God spoke to Moses. Clear on that. We don't even know where this Jesus guy comes from. And again, the response from this blind man, the audacity, it's so striking. He says, well, isn't that strange that you don't know where this guy comes from? Because he's doing stuff that you guys have talked about the Messiah doing. He healed my eyes, and you don't know where he comes from? And they start spitting some truth back to the Pharisees, things that the Pharisees had been saying to him. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he's ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. And ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. So if this man's not from God, he couldn't have done it. I love this. Their critique of his experience, trying to put him in a box, tell him who he is, and tell him who Jesus is. He just responds with, let me tell you about what Jesus did for me. Plain and simple. State the facts. I was blind. Now I can see. And that's not your everyday thing. I'm more interested in trusting in him and what he knows than trusting in you and what you supposedly know. And they don't like it. That's disruptive speak. That's messing with the system. That's offensive. And rather than open their eyes to the truth of Christ standing before them in this man's testimony, they harden their hearts and just sink further back into what they supposedly already know. And they label this man exactly like Jesus' disciples did at the very beginning of the passage. Hard hearts to hard hearts. Here's what happens. Verse 34. They say, you were born a total sinner. Man, we can't give God any props for what he said. You were born a total sinner. Are you seriously trying to teach us, the righteous, what God can do? And they threw him out of the synagogue, which we know meant a whole lot more than just being booted out of church for that day. Like, this was a life-altering experience for this guy. But he was willing to stand before the religious authorities and say, I don't know you, but I know what Jesus did for me, and risk it all. Amazing experience. Now, being born again as a Christian can be confusing. As you find all through the scriptures, being made new, which is what you are when you trust in Christ. He makes you a new creation, sets you free, forgives you of all the junk, gets rid of the shame, makes you new. That can be disorienting, especially for your life, like when you're trying to figure out how to put off the old self and put on the new self, but it's also confusing and disorienting for other people who are close to you. Remember the beginning of the story? These people who knew this guy day in, day out, they're like, this can't be the same dude. Like, this might be disorienting for you. Your family members, your coworkers may have a hard time. And what's going to happen is those people who have a hard time processing what's happened to you are going to try to label you instead of deal with the reality that Jesus has changed your life. They're going to try to define your experience for you and figure, like, this can't be Jesus. You know what's happening? They're putting you in a little box so they don't have to deal with the glory of God shining through you. They don't want to have to take you seriously. So how do we respond? Born again Christians, made new in Christ, cleaving onto him when other people doubt what Jesus has done for us. Well, I think we learn from this man that we just stick to the facts. Man, I don't know all those fancy words that you're telling me. I don't necessarily have to be well-schooled in postmodern philosophy to understand what's going on today. Here's what I know. I don't know what you know. Here's what I know. I was blind. Now I see. I'm going to stick to those facts. You can do the same thing too. Trust in what God has already revealed to you in the ways that he has changed your life. Be the blind man of the story, not the Pharisee. Now, Jesus gets word of what's happened. The Pharisees have ran this guy out of the synagogue with this kangaroo court, and he shows back up. This is what he says. Do you believe in the Son of Man? He finds the dude. Do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man answers, well, who is he? I want to believe. Like, I'm willing to trust you. Point me in the right direction. He says, well, lucky for you, he's standing right in front of you. You have seen him. He's speaking to you. He says, yes, Lord, I believe. And then he worships Jesus. And then Jesus reveals what's been happening in this story, which we've probably already picked up on with some of the language. He says, I entered this world to render judgment, to give sight to the blind, help those who need it, and to show those who think they see that they are blind. And so the Pharisees, they overhear this, and they say, are you saying we're blind? And Jesus, just the truth bomb just keeps coming. If you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty. But you're guilty because you claim to see. So this text, I think, begs a really important question that we have to deal with ourselves today and ask. Like, am I, by Jesus' standard, spiritually blind? Who am I in this story? And then a bigger question, a question of epistemology, is how do I know if I'm spiritually blind? Right? It gets a little bit deeper. The irony of this whole scene is the Pharisees who claim to see, who are claiming to lead this once blind man to truth, are literally the blind leading the blind in the story. Like, who are we? What type of knowledge of God does God desire us to have? Big, deep questions. So multiple times, the Pharisees claim to know all the truth they need to know. And we have this blind man who claims to not really know much of anything. But we find out he knows all that he needs to know by finding the truth incarnate. Your faith in Jesus and what he's done to transform your life is what's called in philosophy a brute fact. That means there is no line of rational thinking, no extra experience, no additional input that could ever possibly disqualify your belief and your experience in God. When you have been raised to new life with Jesus, that's not something that the outside world can actually critique and make you not believe in anymore. But it's confusing because we don't immediately understand everything. The new life of a Christian is like, what is going on here? Well, I know I've been made new, but I'm still struggling with this old stuff, and these people are telling me all this stuff. I'm supposed to be like, what am I supposed to do? I want to give you what I think is a helpful, sobering, practicable line today as like the main point from this passage. We aren't called to know everything, just the one who knows it all. Like, that should take a load off of your shoulders today when you're trying to think about how to live in this really crazy world and everything that's going on and all the different opinions about everything, even inside of your own household. Here's the truth for you. You don't have to know everything. You just got to know the one who knows it all. And he has a name. His name is Jesus. And we live in an age where our society wants to poke a hole in like one particular element of Christianity, and they feel like if they do that, they're like taking out a brick and the whole wall is going to fall down. And we all so easily are tempted to believe just that. That if there's one experience in your life that could be flip-flopped, if there's one element of Christian doctrine or theology that you could be convinced away from, if there's one sort of like, biblical studies question that wants to derail your faith, we're so tempted to think if anybody can find one tiny crack in the wall, by the way, that we built, that the whole thing is going to come crumbling down. Let me just tell you the truth. If your world comes crumbling down because one part of your so-called knowledge doesn't pan out to be true, you've built on the wrong foundation. Like, Jesus is the solid rock, the cornerstone, the one in whom it's all built for. I fear so many times we trust in the system instead of the Son of God. That's why we're so easily picked apart. That's why it's so easy to doubt everything when we just start to doubt one thing. we become just like the Pharisees, who, when Jesus is poking a hole in their Sabbath practice, can't even see Jesus anymore. Like, don't do that. That's not what the Christian faith is about. One individual practice, one individual piece of doctrine. If you think your whole world comes crumbling down because of that, then you're not seeing and trusting in the truth incarnate, Jesus Christ. He is the foundation of our faith, and he will never come tumbling down. And your experience of being made new in him through the resurrection is not something that can be disqualified because of something else happening in your life. Trust in Jesus, not the system. That's something that the religious leaders in the first century couldn't get. We just have to do a better job of getting that today. Anybody seen the Anchorman movies? So in Anchorman 1 and 2, the second one probably shouldn't have been made. Will Ferrell plays this honorary anchorman, and he's at a global news network. What happens partway through the story is Will Ferrell finds himself blind. His character finds himself blind. And so what does he do? Rather than trying to lean on his friends and this one element of his life becoming a real issue, figuring out how to build around it and still work and function, he just becomes a recluse in a lighthouse. He just pulls away from everybody, and he lets that one element of his life completely define him, that one area of doubt or change to completely derail his experience. So what happens is partway through that story, his news team comes to visit him a couple of months later. You get this scene. His news buddies come to see him, and they sit down, and the scene opens up with Ron Burgundy making a fire in the dishwasher. And you can see that his fridge is used to store shoes like a shoe rack. And his buddies come and sit in the living room, and he brings out a tray of hors d'oeuvres, which are supposedly Triscuits and pimento loaf, and it's actually checkers with cock. And it's such a disorienting experience for his buddies. And Brick, Steve Carell's character, actually bites into one of the checkers. It's nuts. And Will Ferrell starts to talk about his experience now that he is blind. He talks about the terror of waking up in the morning and the great adventure of breakfast. He shares a story of how recently he came downstairs and bit hard into an ashtray, believing that it was a warm, flaky waffle. Oh, I wanted that waffle so bad. And his friends look at him like, because you've lost your sight, can you no longer feel? Like, you couldn't tell that wasn't a warm, soft, flaky waffle? And he says, I'm blind, guys. And you're like, what? And it continues with more ridiculous stories about how recently he drank more than half of a bottle of ketchup before he realized it wasn't a nice, fine bottle of aged wine. And one of his buddies says, that's like 6 or 7 gulps. You couldn't tell that wasn't ketchup? And he says, I'm blind, right? The scene is just ridiculous. It continues to unfold. I would have shown you a section if they could have kept it clean for more than like 2 seconds. But the temptation is when we doubt one thing or have one thing change in our lives to just let the whole thing fall apart and believe that nothing makes sense anymore. The taste, touch, whatever, it's just all gone and out the window because I can't do what I wanted to do anymore. Don't fall for that. Just because we lack one element of knowledge, right? Because we're confused about one element or aspect of Christianity, that doesn't mean you have to doubt everything. The blind man doesn't know a lot of things, but he knows all that he needs to know in finding Jesus. We would do better if we started to practice this, because our lack of totally understanding everything shouldn't lead us to radical skepticism. It should lead us to radical faith in the one who knows it all. We can make that shift in our lives. When I graduated college, I thought I knew pretty much everything. Anybody had shared experience with that, right? At the undergraduate level, you're just kind of spoon-fed a system and you regurgitate it and you're like, you're now educated. You know, that's what happens. So I came out of there, I'm like, man, I know I got this. I got this on lock. And then I got a master's degree in theology, and I was like, whoa. Things aren't as clear-cut as I thought. The categories are a little bit broader. I experienced a whole lot more things, some different thoughts, different perspectives, different systems, different categories. And the one thing that I so value about my master's education is I learned how much I still don't know. It was like the most helpful thing, humbling thing, illuminating thing to come out of school. There's so much I don't know yet. Now, that sort of truth, that sort of reality that I experienced could lead me in 2 directions. I could say, well, if I can't know everything, then I can't know anything. if I don't have access to the entire picture, if I can't answer every single fine point of theological questioning that I've come up with, then this whole thing is a farce. You could go down that direction, and lots of people do. I have really good friends that I respect and that I care for who have done just that. One element of their faith was made rocky and proved out to be sand, right? Because of some of the things that they've experienced in their lives, and they just forsook the whole thing. It could lead you to radical skepticism when you realize you don't know something, or it could lead you to radical faith in the one who knows it all. I learned through my master's education how much I don't know, and it brought me closer to Jesus because he is the truth, and the truth will set me free. I think the greatest thing I learned in that season of my life was how to embrace this ancient proverb that you've all known. But maybe it has a clearer focus today after the story in John chapter 9. It's Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 7. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Much like this dude in chapter 9. I may not know much. You may not know much. But I know the truth incarnate, and he has set me free. There are so many things shouting in my life and shouting in your life to make you distrust things. Shoot back with the facts. I was blind. Now I see. Jesus did that for me, and he can do that for you. And that's all we really need to trust in.